Now, the House of Commons was lively yesterday as Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle delivered a serious scolding to Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch, signalling his displeasure at her handling of post-Brexit plans to scrap EU laws.
The animated speaker said, "Who do you think you're speaking to?" after the Secretary of State apologised for her handling of the announcement. Was the Speaker right to chastise the Secretary of State, or should he just wind his neck in?
Let's take a look at what happened in the Commons yesterday.
We are elected to hear it first, not to read it in the Telegraph, and certainly not a WMS is satisfactory on such an important matter.
I'm very sorry that the sequencing that we chose was not to your satisfaction.
That is totally not acceptable. Who do you think you're speaking to, Secretary of State? I am the defender of this House and these benches on both sides. I am not going to be spoken to by a Secretary of State who is absolutely not accepting my ruling. These members have been elected by their constituents and they have the right to hear it first. And it is time this government recognised we're all elected, we're all members of Parliament, and use the correct manners.
Whoa.
Well, there you go. With us in the studio, the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and GB News senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. So, we had somebody in the blue corner, somebody in the red corner there. Henry, who was in the right?
It is the modern convention that you should give important news to the House of Commons first. It's important to note that has not always been the case. It really sort of developed in the 80s and 90s. It's not something that goes back all the way into the mists of time. But in modern times, it's expected.
Well, it wouldn't have gone into the mists of time. They didn't have tellies then, did they? So it wouldn't have gone into the mists of time.
For example, Winston Churchill made lots of important announcements and then just let the House of Commons wait until he'd finished saying it on the radio and then came to the Parliament and then read it out his radio broadcast to MPs. But in modern times, it's expected that the government should make announcements first. And so when ministers go to the media, that's what Sir Lindsay was angry about.
Yeah, and, you know, in the Express got a fabulous picture here, and he says, you know, which we saw the clip there, fury, he snapped. I mean, it is incorrect to do what Kemi did and go to the media first. I'm somebody who's had UQs and had to go and apologise before the Speaker. Did you think he went over the top, Lindsay, or do you think he was right to lay down the rules?
I think Lindsay Hoyle was absolutely right. I think he's the best Speaker we've had for years. And it's quite clear that what ministers should do is tell Parliament first before they go to the press. Now, of course, I'm in a bit two minds here. As a journalist, I rather like them coming to me first so I can break the news. But I do understand what the conventions are, and I think it's been something that has been progressively getting worse over the last few years. David Cameron did it quite a lot by leaking stuff to the media before it appeared in Parliament, and it just seems to be that's been a progressive thing. So Lindsay Hoyle was absolutely right. On this particular issue, I don't understand why they leaked it to the media in the first place, on the basis that we knew the EU retained law was going to change, and so they could have actually told MPs.
All right, well, stay with us, and joining us now to discuss this further is expert Philip Norton there. It seemed to escalate the upset between the Speaker there and Kemi Badenoch. Did she make matters worse with the way she approached her apology? Because it really is an apology when you're brought to the House in this way.
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. There are two elements, aren't there? One's the point of principle that you've been discussing, that ministers are expected to make policy announcement first to the House of Commons. That's embodied in the Ministerial Code, Section 9.1, if you want to be precise, making clear that major public policy change should be announced first to the Commons. But then there's the element in which Kemi Badenoch apologised for it. I think it's making sound as if it was, you know, personal to the Speaker, whereas the Speaker's point was this is a requirement, a courtesy requirement that you should inform the House. So I think putting those two things together and it created the response that you got. I don't think it's specific to the current Speaker. You can imagine other speakers. You can imagine how Betty Boothroyd would have responded in those circumstances to make it quite clear to ministers. And the frustration, I think, that speakers feel, because, of course, they've no sanction other than making life difficult for ministers in terms of making sure they do actually comply with the requirements. So formally, it's really up to the Prime Minister, because the ministerial code is in the gift of the Prime Minister. He signs it, he's responsible.
And I was going to say, Kemi Badenoch's come out not so well in the papers today, the way she handled it, the way she spoke to people, what she said. A faux pas on her behalf?
I think, yes, I mean, the way she handled it, the form of words for which she apologised made it sound as if she's almost resenting coming to the House, and of course her defence was this isn't a major change of policy, it's the means rather than the ends that were being affected. So that was her defence, but I think the way she went about it just made matters worse in trying to defend it before the House. It wasn't just the Speaker, it was members as well who clearly were not impressed by the way it'd been done.
But, Philip, I mean, I understand that, and I think the Speaker's absolutely right to try and enforce this convention that major announcements are made to Parliament first, and I support the Speaker in trying to defend that. But, I mean, this isn't anything really new, is it? I mean, every week, virtually, I read in the Sunday papers some new government announcement that then is followed up on Monday afternoon in Parliament with an urgent question or a statement. So, I mean, is this just the way of the world now, with a 24-hour sort of news that governments have to keep them informed with something, and therefore this is just inevitable, and maybe the House of Commons just needs to accept that this is the way it's always going to be now?
Well, it's certainly government's become much more leaky over time. I mean, you can remember the time when any leak by a minister, remember the resignation of Hugh Dalton as Chancellor, any leak would be taken seriously, whereas now government leaks like a sieve. And you've got that under, particularly a lot depends on who the Prime Minister is as to whether they can enforce discipline on the Cabinet. But you've had successive Prime Ministers, Harold Wilson onwards, reminding Cabinet not to leak, which is usually admission they have been leaking, and it's usually, at that stage, ineffective. So I think you're absolutely right, given the mode of media and the propensity of members of government to maintain close contacts with the media.
Lord Philip Norton, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. Just quickly, Henry, I mean, in some respects, is this row quite convenient for Kemi Badenoch? Because actually it takes attention away from the fact that the government are not going to be repealing all of these EU-retained laws, and that she'd sooner have a row perhaps over whether she announced it to the Daily Telegraph first or the House of Commons, rather than the focus being on actual the fact that the substance that these EU laws are not going to be repealed.
I mean, this is certainly the kind of story that has very little cut through, I think, outside the people who follow Westminster professionally, right? Like, did she follow the rules of the House is not going to be on the doorstep in 2024. So it might actually suit her. And actually, if I'm honest, the way that she's been really forthright about some of her critics in all of this, whatever you think of the policy, I actually find it a little bit refreshing compared to the slightly more mealy-mouthed way that some ministers would have gone about executing a similar U-turn.
Thank you very much.